Okay, so I think we're live, and I'd like to welcome everybody to Litquake's Epicenter series, which is a spring and summer virtual series hosted by Litquake, San Francisco's literary festival, now in our 22nd year. I am Jane Ganal. I'm the co-founder of Litquake, and we are streaming live from the Bay Area and actually from the East Coast and around the world. This year, our festival will take place October 7th through 23rd. And it will be a hybrid festival this year, which means we'll have some live events, if you can imagine that. And we'll also still be streaming here at litquake.org. Tonight, we are honored to be able to present Pulitzer Prize winning poet Forrest Gander. He's appearing for his new collection, Twice Alive, which was just released by New Directions. Of this new collection, NPR raved. In Gander's follow-up to his extraordinary book of loss and lamentation, Be With, this poet of metaphysical abstraction, eros, and intimate observation and even adulation of the natural world finds fresh metaphors for the sudden and uneasy onset of new love. That might be the longest and most complicated sentence I ever said. Anyway, many thanks to Peter and everyone at City Lights for co-presenting this event. And you can buy Forrest's book directly from City Lights at the link that's already in the chat section. And by the way, to set up your chat, you just go to the bottom of the screen and click chat, and you'll see that there. Quick orders of business. Think about any questions you might like to ask Forrest after his presentation, and put those questions in the chat feature, and I will field them myself. After the event, you'll be asked to fill out a short survey. Please do this because it impacts our funding. Don't forget to follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. And last but not least, a little pitch for money. The Bay Area was already a difficult place for creative people, as we all know, before the pandemic. And now we are actively rebuilding our communities. And if you believe that keeping literature a key component of that cultural landscape is important, then please consider donating a few dollars. We accept donations at Venmo at Litquake or on PayPal at info@litquake or directly at litquake.org. Okay, enough intros. Let us get on with introducing tonight's guest. We are so honored to have Forrest Gander. He was awarded the 2019 Pulitzer Prize in Poetry for his book, Be With. The Pulitzer Board described the work as a collection of elegies that grapple with sudden loss and the difficulties of expressing grief and yearning for the departed. Forrest lost both his mother and his wife, the poet C.D. Wright, in the same year, and this book confronts those losses from myriad angles. He was also a Pulitzer Prize finalist in 2012 for Core Samples from the World, which was described by the prize board as a compelling work that explores cross-cultural tensions in the world and digs deeply to identify what is essential in our human experience. And just a brief bio, Forrest was born in the Mojave Desert, presumably in a town and not just in the desert, and spent important periods of his life in San Francisco, where I know he got his MFA, in Mexico and in Arkansas. He has degrees in both geology and English literature, and he is the author of numerous books of poetry, translation, fiction, and essays. He is the A.K. Seaver Professor of Literary Arts and Comparative Literature at Brown, and a Rockefeller Fellow, that is a tongue twister, and he has been the recipient of grants from everyone, it seems like, from the NEA to the Guggenheim. Please welcome Forrest Gander.
Thank you, Jane. I'm no longer teaching at Brown, which is why I get to live in the West Coast at Petaluma. So I'm a professor emeritus. And yeah, thank you, Jane. Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Hunter. I'll be reading tonight and sort of introducing, this is my first introduction of the book, public introduction of the book, the new book, which is called Twice Alive, An Ecology of Intimacies. It's published by New Directions, and I give my enormous gratefulness to my editor there, Declan Spring, and to the editors, Brittany Dennison and Mika Chu. And I want to thank City Lights Books in San Francisco and my friends there. This book, Twice Alive, begins with 3 short epigraphs. And a lot of the book has to do with the notion of intimacy as emerging, and uses often lichen as a model. So the 3 short epigraphs are: a garden without lichen is a garden without hope. Drew Milne. My every moment I've lived a second time. Giuseppe Ungaretti in Geoffrey Brock's translation. And who need be afraid of the merge, from Walt Whitman. And then the book begins with an author's note. It's not very long, and I hope you'll find it interesting. What many of us learned in high school about lichen, that it's an indicator species for pollution. Litmus, in fact, is derived from lichen, and that it's the synergistic alliance of a fungus, an algae, or cyanobacteria, is largely true, but simplified. If lichen ecology has more to do with collaboration than competition, it's nevertheless true that collaboration is transformative. With lichen, which may be more related to animals than plants, the original organisms are changed utterly in their compact. They cannot return to what they were. And according to Anne Pringle, one of the leading contemporary mycologists with whom I had the lucky opportunity to collaborate, it may be that lichen do not, given sufficient nutrients, age. Anne and other contemporary biologists are saying that our sense of the inevitability of death may be determined by our mammalian orientation. Perhaps some forms of life have theoretical immortality. Lichen can reproduce asexually, and when they do, bits of both partners are dispersed together to establish in a new habitat. How long can the partners of a lineage continue to reproduce? No one knows. The thought of 2 things that merge, mutually altering each other, 2 things that intermingled and interactive become one thing that does not age, brings me to think of the nature of intimacy. Isn't it often in our most intimate relations that we come to realize that our identity, all identity, is combinatory? Obeyed. For those who we lost, including my mother during the pandemic. Can you hear dawn? Can you hear dawn edging close? Hear soft light with its vacuum fingertips gripping the bedroom wall. An understated what? Exhilaration? Can you hear the voices, if they can be called voices, of towies scratching in the garden, and then the creaky, low, husky voice flecked with sleep beside you in bed, telling a dream slowly as though in real time. And now, interrupting that dream, can you make out the voice, if it can be called a voice, of absence speaking intimately to you directly, using the names of those who were vulnerable, those who are gone? I know you must hear it feelingly, a low vibration in your bones, for don't you find yourself absorbed in a next moment beyond your given life? Unto ourselves. Even when we realized we'd stopped, in every essential way stopped moving forward, when we came to see we were descending, even more tightly bound to the vortex, as images rushed by in front of us, and a blue whale rotted on the sand in Bolinas, its stink drifting southward, where dozens of barnacled 40-foot grays, dead from starvation, began to hulk against the shore, the white tufted foreheads of waves smashing against those knolls of oily, decomposing flesh. It was everywhere we looked, if we cared to look, out over the bite-sized squares of cheese and Saintsbury wine, into the hum taking place under a coved moon, or cared to listen to clumped wild rye shushing the dunes, while pulverized rock shrieked along fault lines in decibels so muted only the soles of our feet conducting the ground's sound up into our tali could register what was happening. Right there where our lives had been, cut off from themselves and become something else, drained of substance, steeped into privilege against which we protested with those we called our friends, the ones who lately seemed to contract backward from our greetings, giving us to suspect that they too sensed something askew, the skip at the center of ourselves, or just an inkling of abyssal unhappiness, was it? Concentrated into the early evenings, like one of those spectral white fallow deer introduced to the headlands that began to outcompete native species, and so, before they were slaughtered, every one by hired hunters, inciting arguments about what was native if all systems are given to change. Maybe our ear twitches, maybe the deer's ear twitches, but we still can't quite make out in the dimness what we're looking at, can we? Nor is there interim from the tumult of incoming, the masticating chores, ping-pings begging immediate response, the sheer overabundance of the present, shame, which plugs up each minute and stands in now for whatever it meant to live oneself, before every gesture became performance for an audience we imagine never to be finished with looking at us. And as for the budding out of being we'd called passion, or the sensual moments phrased into our gait when we were coming to feel something, when our shadows merged, not as romance, but the real consequence of our mutuality, with shadows of conifers along the steep ravine, and completely naked and without relief, the world parsed us into the inhuman, where roseate lichen surged across rocks lacking nothing that might be needed to answer for our existence. By now, some of us outmaneuvered by the economy were lying around Dolores Park like fallen fruit waiting to rot. Others found themselves receptive to a trivial, self-justifying kindness. What with coral belching up its algae, the constellations receding, the awakened tundra, how could we bear, we wondered to each other, even the weight of our own sorry initiatives? Life, someone countered, is pure gratuitous magnitude. Just look, the light is there, grace itself. But it was already noon, and as we looked, the colors of the hills began to blanch, and all around us, in the field of the visible, we sensed, without speaking, duration's ebb. In 2017, the literary critic Lynn Keller invited me to collaborate with her, with the noted mycologist Anne Pringle, and with the artist Emily Arthur at Huron Mountain Wildlife Foundation on Lake Huron, an experience that birthed this, the book's title series, from which this section I'm going to read is only the first. Twice Alive. Mycobiont, just beginning to enwrap photobiont, each to become something else, its own life, and a contested mutuality. Twice alive, algal cells swaddled in clusters. You take a 3-lens jeweler's loop to inspect the holdfast of the umbilicate lichen, then the rock tripe lichen, then the Irenic amanita mushroom, swarming with a kind of mite that has no anus, then the delicious chanterelles called trumpets of death. Supreme parsimony in drought lets lichen live on sporadic events of dew and fog, a velvety tomentum and a wet thallus. I crush oak moss between finger and thumb for its sweet perfume, persistent on your skin when I touch your throat, so slow to evaporate, the memory of seeing sunburst lichen on the sandstone cliff. Though crustose lichen relish decay, vagrant lichen go all hygroscopic spores spurting out through walls split at the invagination fronts. But if herbivores eat wolf lichen, they die. And if carnivores eat it, they die, writhing in pain, with the exception of mice. It is rarely possible to tell if lichen is dead or alive. The fuzz of fecal dust from lichenivorous mites triggers woodcutters' eczema, the bane of loggers, knee-deep in sweet fern, sawing down cedar. In the presence of water, photobionts go turgid. In hours of dark respiration, a spermatic green corn smell takes the shape of a lamellated mushroom. In cavitating symplasts, spores loosen into the elongation zone on a night of caterwauling loons. So evening finds us at this wood's edge, where at a dead oak's base, shoestring rot glimmers, its luminescent rhizomes reflected from the eyes of a foraging raccoon that doesn't yet sense us. Air ghostly and damp clings as we step from our woods to look across the field toward the first lane of lit houses, their dull pewter auras restrained by wet haze. Cordyceps, the brown of your eyes, softened with rain and remotely fluorescent, dissolve into slime after a few days. Whatever we thought we were following was following us, its intention unlinked to our own. That sequence runs through the book in 3 segments. Another sequence that runs through the book is called Sangam Acoustics. And because Sangam poetry isn't well known here, I'll tell you just a little bit that between 300 BCE and 300 CE, about 2,000 years ago, there was a flourishing literature in southern India that has come to be called Sangam, or meeting place. Among the 2 main forms of that literature is a poetry called Akam, in which human subjectivity is understood to be inseparable from the very particular landscapes in which those people lived and felt. California, where I live, shares the same 5 major landscapes of southern India, and the sequence of poems I've written under the title Sangam Acoustics are influenced by the time I've spent in India with my partner, the sculptor Ashwini Bhatt, and by English translations of Sangam poems, though my poems are definitively placed in California. Forest, 1R. Forest. Erogenous zones in oaks slung with stoles of lace lichen, the sun's rays spilling through leaves in broken packets. A force, call it nighttime, thrusts mushrooms up from their lair of spawn, mycelial loam, the whiff of port. They pop into untrammeled air with the sort of gasp that follows a fine chess move. Like memories, are they, or punctuation, Was it something the earth said to provoke our response, tasking us to recall an evolutionary course, our long ago initiation into the one among others? And within my newborn noticing, have you popped up beside me, love? Or were you here from the start, a swarm of meaning and decay, still gripping the underworld? Both of us half buried, holding fast, if briefly, to a swelling vastness, while our coupling begins to register in the already awake compendium that offers to take us in. You take me in, and abundance floods us, floats us out. We fill each with the other. All morning breaks as birdsong over us, who rise to the surface so our faces might be sprung. So that was Forrest. This is this sea poem called Immigrant Sea. Every sea is an immigrant sea. Aroused by her inaccessibility, he aches for more of her life to live inside him, watching the breakers, standing so close he can feel heat coming off her wet scalp. What is his relation to this person before him, so familiar and foreign? The way he searches out her face, he searches out himself. Gusts thrash crests of swell, spring grasses twirl circles in the sand where they stand without speaking. She wants him to know it's all charged, even grass, positive, pollen, negative. So when grass waves, it sweeps the air for pollen. He feels electricity all around, as though the wild drama of the coming storm were already aware of them, foreigners on this shore. Little sapphire blue flowers speckle the dunes. He wonders if he has let himself flatten out into a depthless sheet like escalator stairs, whether in the end he'll disappear underground without the smallest lurch of resistance. But when her lavish face turns toward him, beaming, the corners of her eyes wind wet, he yields to that excess. He reappears to himself. The five basic landscapes that the Sangam poems cover are forest, water, sea, um, uh, pastoral, pasture, flatlands, grasslands, wasteland, and mountains. This is this is one of the wasteland poems that I wrote for Santa Rosa after the fires ran through that town and destroyed so much. And I live in the town just south of Santa Rosa, and there were so many refugees that came to live in Petaluma for a while. Wasteland for Santa Rosa. Green, excuse me, green spring grass on the hills had cured by June, and by July, gone woolly and brown, it crackled underfoot, desiccated, while within the clamor of live oaks, an infestation of tiny larvae clung to the underleaves, feeding between veins. Their frass, that fine dandruff of excrement and boring dust, tinkled as it dropped onto dead leaves below the limbs. You could hear it tinkling 20 feet away. Across the valley on Sugarloaf Ridge, the full moon showed up like a girl doing cartwheels. No one goes on living the life that isn't there. Below a vast column of smoke, heat, flame, and wind, I rose, swaying and tottering on my erratic vortex, extemporizing my own extreme weather, sucking up acres of scorched topsoil and spinning it outward in a burning sleet of filth and embers that catapulted me forward with my mouth open in every direction at once. So I came for you, turning the present into purgatory, because I need to turn everything to tragedy before I can see it, because it must be leavened with remorse for the feeling to rise. I think I'll just read one more poem, and with Hunter's help, we'll show it as a little video, and it's also called Forest. Hunter, is there sound? Can we try it again with sound?
Sorry, just turning the sound on now for us. Sorry about that.
Thanks.
Post-fire forest. Shadows of shadows without canopy, phalanxes of carbonized trunks and snags, their inner momentum shorted out. They surround us in early morning like plutonic pillars, like mute clairvoyants leading a sursum corda, like the excrescence of some long slaughter. All that moves is mist lifting, too indistinct to be called ghostly. From scorched mycelial layers of rain-moistened earth, what remains of the forest takes place in the exclamatory mode. Cindered utterances in a tongue from which everything trivial has been volatilized, everything trivial to fire. In a notch between near hills, stubbled with black paroxysm, we spot a familiar sun, liquid glass globed at the blowpipe's tip. If this landscape is dreaming, it must dream itself awake. You have, everyone notes, a rare talent for happiness. I wonder how to value that, walking through wreckage. On the second day, a black-backed woodpecker answers your call, but we search until twilight without finding it.
Although that poem is for Ashwini Bhatt, it's dedicated to the poet and biologist Maya Khosla, with whom we accompanied to look at these post-burned landscapes, these forests, and the recovering animals, birds in them. I think that's maybe good for tonight, Jane.
Oh, I was kind of fighting tears during that last part. There's something about fire that it can really render people so vulnerable and anguished, and sorrowful. But that poem, I mean, it was not. It was sort of the opposite of that. It felt hopeful. And anyway, I was not quite ready to come on and moderate, but yet here we are.
Well, the amazing thing about a lot of the burned forests is how quickly they regenerate. And so what a tragedy it is when the land is given to the timber companies to simply come in and cut all of the dead forest down, because very quickly animals begin to re-inhabit that forest. And when it's just clear cut for the timber industry, it's a really bad way to deal with burned forests and its re-inhabitation.
I'm guessing that the earth, it would be much better off with just natural fires than clear cutting. We have a couple questions already here, and anyone who's watching, please feel free to, you can either add it in the chat section or down below on your screen where it says Q&A. Joel has a question. Actually, he has two. For the first poems that Forrest read, I was following along in a Kindle preview version of the book and noticed a few differences between the printed word and the oral version. What's that about, basically? Any comments on that?
Don't tell anybody about what you know. Those close readers, they're such trouble. Yeah, it's like Valerie says about a translation, it never is finished, it's only abandoned. I reworked that obeyed a little bit after the published version, and that happens in my books. A lot of my books have corrections or changes in them after they've been published. If I ever have a collected or selected poems, it'll look a little different from the original poems. Marianne Moore did that also, notably to the worse from my reader. I hope I'm not doing the same thing. But
so it's not like you would go to a reading someplace in a bookstore or whatever, and like a rock band that altered its lyrics, there aren't people in the audience going, hey, where are the normal words?
But thanks for noticing that. That's a kind of beautiful act of attention.
Well, and second person, Alan also said can you comment on the revisions, which you kind of have done already, but is that because each poem is like a living, breathing animal that you continue to just look at in different ways? Or
yeah, it's hard to put them to sleep, they keep yeah, it takes years, and so I make I'm happy with the original version, but I think I continue to make little changes that continue to make the poem better, and I'm okay about that. It's all a process, right?
Right.
Art.
I actually had a question myself, and it was about it was from a Q&A you did about the Pulitzer win. And I was really intrigued by an answer you gave to the question on what guidance you would give an aspiring poet. And I was really intrigued by what you said, which is that literature isn't an enterprise only for self-valuation. You said start a press, a reading series, write and publish reviews, launch a blog, apprentice yourself to the whole hog of the art. And I thought that's interesting, not to self-reference Litquake, but that's kind of what we're about, is like, literature is not just for self-valuation, but to see how it can, change lives and bring people together. So
no, that's exactly right. And the community that you've built over time with Litquake is really powerful, and coming together and meeting people there and hearing fantastic readers from all over. That's what I signed up for when I signed on to be a poet. I want to be in that company. I want to be turned on by people who are doing things I can't do. and that I can be inspired by. And I think those people that just write and wait to be discovered are missing a big part of the enterprise. For one thing, none of our words are ever our own anyway. They come from others. We're born into a language that precedes us. So it's already social. It's already in relation. And one of the things I'm interested in eco-poetry is stressing and trying to articulate the way that it's not just in relation to other people, not just other people who speak our language, but with translation and reading across borders, other languages, but also other species and the world itself, including the inanimate world, that we're in relation to that. And that's something that we need to take account of ethically as well as aesthetically.
There were actually a couple questions about the sound effect that you, during your reading of Twice Alive, the shamanic thump of your glass seemed to offer us an opening to the unknowable, perhaps a calling to twin, such that it might call a myth to loosen us into the twice living, perhaps to our own intentions to be twice alive. Lichen, is this at all close to your intent?
That's a really beautiful reading of it. I wish I'd put that in my book. But yeah, multiple things. Also, to bring the world into the reading with a stone. I was a geology major. I like stones. I like to think about what we stand on, and also the poem is written in these bursts that are separated by a lot of space, and to represent that somehow, and also that sort of stamp, the sort of binding that that might happen when two things come together and are clapped together and become one thing. It's acting that out, but also a lot of that poem is written about the circumambulation of Mount Tamalpais that a number of Buddhist poets have taken, including Gary Snyder and Allen Ginsberg and Whalen and Kerouac all went on this journey around the mountain and stopped at places and chanted and stopped and chanted, and that talismanic beat of the rock on the table seems like it's part of the incantation of the world and the world in relationship to the seekers.
That's wonderful. It certainly punctuated that poem in a very interesting way, and I was really listening intently. I want to throw out another kind of humorous question here, that in this same interview, you say that you started writing poems at a very early age because your mother was an elementary school teacher who read a lot, including poems by Edgar Allan Poe and Carl Sandburg. And it said, in high school, I thought I was a hotshot poet. It wasn't until my freshman year in college that a professor saw my work and told me, Forrest, these poems are terrible.
He said exactly that. He gave me the news.
And it's that's, but what's interesting is that you said that was the moment when I became serious about reading contemporary poetry. So yeah. It's kind of like the importance of finding people whose work you admire and learning from it as you read it.
It is, and also not just going to people for praise, but for an honest evaluation. That's what we really want, because we're not writing about our egos. We're writing to make art that maybe will exceed our egos and will transcend who we are. that's always what I'm hoping for. It's to write something that goes beyond myself, and it's usually not praise that that gets someone all the way there.
There's a poignant comment on our Facebook feed, because we're also live on Facebook, saying how much your work means to this person because she had just lost her brother. So I'm guessing that, the larger reward, more than praise and adulation, is knowing that your words somehow, find an impact.
It's yeah, that was something I found with Be With, that that people are annealed in grief. They're annealed to each other. They're sort of bonded, and are looking for ways to articulate that negotiation of the abyss, and um, and shattered cores, and that's the great thing about art, is that I think, at least for me, in my experience, is that other work has done that for me. It's articulated things that I haven't been able to articulate myself, and I've felt some sense of relief in that, and some sense of communion, and maybe that's what living is about, is trying to find some kind of communion with others. I think art can often lead the way there.
Just on the same topic of doing art, for the congratulations, I guess, and the adulation. You were a Pulitzer Prize finalist and then a Pulitzer Prize winner. So what did that all mean in terms of kind of how you see yourself and your abilities, and how, what kind of platform did it give you after that? Or did it change at all?
I don't know. I mean, it was a very hard book to be celebrating for me, because it was a book about a very intense pain and grief, and person that I really would like to share that happiness with, was the very person I couldn't share that happiness with. And then the Pulitzer, I don't know all of what it means. I do have more of an audience because of the attention that book got. But at the same time, the difference between the Pulitzer in fiction and the Pulitzer in poetry is, logarithmic. The Pulitzer and the wonderful writer, Richard Powers, who, in fiction, he immediately had a television series, and and all his stuff. My next book, Twice Alive, has just come out. It didn't get a single review, not even a Publisher's Weekly review. So I don't know what kind of, well, also, that's not again what matters finally. What matters is that it meets some readers, and New Directions books have often been the kind of books that haven't generated a lot of attention at first, and become more and more important over time. I mean, that's been the history of their foresightful publishing. I don't know that mine will be that, but I feel hope. I think this is the best book that I've ever written, and maybe the Pulitzer gave me some confidence towards writing this book. I'm certain of that.
I want to remind our, many listeners that if you'd like to ask Forrest a question, you can either type it in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, or to the right of the screen in the chat. In the meantime, I will just keep asking the questions that I want to know. that professor, I want to get back to him for a second, that said, Forrest, your poems are terrible. I mean, obviously it was a turning point for you because you remember it well. But obviously it didn't pierce your heart to the degree that you couldn't continue writing, which is great. But how important is that kind of blunt feedback? And is it important to find just anybody who will talk to you, or does it need to be somebody you trust to evaluate your work?
You know that answer, Jane.
I know it has to be somebody you trust, but I just think of how many college professors will sort of puncture, people's balloons, and should we trust them?
Right. Well, I think it depends. You have to feel that what they're saying might be true. Or if you feel that it's not true, then you don't trust that. And that's how we are with most of our criticism. But I've always been grateful to the people who were bluntly honest. I remember as a young poet sending poems to a magazine I really admired, Sulphur, which was edited by Clayton Eshelman, a very interesting poet and an important poet and translator. And the magazine, Sulphur, was an incredible magazine, as were the other magazines he had edited. And he wrote back to me and said, these poems are no good, Forrest, but they do show that maybe sometime in your life you'll write something interesting. It was devastating, but I kept, I continued over the years to send poems to Sulphur. And eventually my poems got better and were published there. I've been grateful for those comments. Has anyone said that?
I was going to say, I doubt at the very moment that you got those messages, you felt grateful for them. I'm sure it was hard to take.
It was a shock, but I didn't throw them away. I kept them, and and I think most of us, I know, at least for myself, even when I think I finish a poem, I think it's terrific. I've worked on this poem for weeks. It's fantastic. I want to show it to someone and have them weep with joy. And it's always after that stage of exuberance and exhilaration that I do the most important work on the poem. So delaying sending out your poem, which can be hard for a young writer, is also a helpful strategy to live with it longer, to put it away, to come back to it and see it in a different light. I learned that over time.
Yeah, for sure. We have a couple new questions. Lisa would like to know, how has the shift to life on the West Coast informed your work? I'm not sure how long you've been in Petaluma. I'm struck particularly by the very specific references to local flora and fauna.
Thank you. Who's that from? That's from
Lisa Taggart.
Lisa Taggart. I wonder if that's the Lisa Taggart who's the artist daughter of John Taggart. So I was born in California, and I went to graduate school, and I was born in the Mojave Desert in Barstow, not in the naked desert, as Jane was noting, and went to grad school in San Francisco. And I always wanted to come back. Just the landscape so impressed me. I just loved living in San Francisco in the early 80s. So when my life came to feel really disastrous on the East Coast after the death of CD, I had a hard time living in the same house, teaching in the same place where we had come across each other every single day. And I fled to a place where I felt my heart had roots, and indeed it does. So I've been there full time for just maybe three and a half years. But it's a return to a place that I know and that I want to know much deeper. the birds are different, the plants are different. I'm working on a garden of local wildflowers, indigenous plants. So it spiritually, it feels like a place of refuge for me when I was looking for refuge.
And it is a beautiful place to take shelter. We have another question from Sherilyn, who says, with all the justifiable attention to Amanda Gorman this year, it seems that people who haven't typically appreciated poetry are beginning to. How do you see poetry entering the public dialogue today?
I think it's amazing. What a great question. Because for so long, people are always bemoaning the death of poetry, and I bemoan but in fact, as the Academy of American Poets has reported, this very large poll of United States readers found that there's been an enormous increase in the readership of poetry in the last, say, 5 years, and that the highest increase in that readership is among young people and people of color. And I think that I think also that living in a media saturated environment where where our language is reduced to Twitter feeds or little familiar things on Facebook, or the kinds of chat where what we write is corrected for us as we write it, that and the images, the constant barrage of images, that people are finding that there's a hole in their souls, and that this most ancient use of language, poetry, that's connected with shamanism, can help fill that hole, because it articulates things that the rest of the media that they're surrounded by doesn't articulate, and it gets down to the deep, mud of their cores, and that's drawing people to poetry. And a lot of wonderful young poets are drawing people to poetry.
I also
And
wonder.
translation also. So at the same time, this just, the last 10 years, there's been much more attention to poetry outside of, and literature outside of our borders. And that's something new for the United States. We've been very satisfied not to explore what's being written in other countries. The traditional thing was 3% of everything published in the US, only 3% was poetry. And it's, something like, it's so much higher in almost every other country. So that's also fed, I think, our imagination for what language can do, because writing in other countries brings in new syntaxes and image repertoires and stories and experiences.
At Litquake, pretty much every festival we have some kind of celebration of translated works, and they're very popular. People, I'm not sure why there isn't more translated work, available. So I don't know, maybe along with poetry, it will be on the upswing.
Yeah, and thanks for you all for giving it some attention.
You're welcome, world. Getting close to the end here. There's one comment. It's not really a question, but it's a comment, and it's kind of funny. One of my dissertation readers, this is from Anna, she said, "This is terrible. I wish I could help you. He is one of my favorite people, and I learned tremendously from him." So I guess I'm the shallow one who thinks that would just crush me like a rock, but
wait, I missed it, Jane. One of her dissertation
readers said, "This is terrible. I wish I could help you."
Oh,
I know.
But if this is the Anna I think, then
Anna,
that's the
Anna
wrong
Dini,
advice.
Anna Dini Morales.
Yeah, no, she can write like a, like a wizard.
Oh, well, there you go, Anna. That is high praise indeed. Well, let's see. How shall we wrap this up? I
Want me
guess
to read a short poem, Jane? to wrap it up?
absolutely. That'd be the perfect way to take us out, so to speak.
Okay. This is another one of the Sangam poems. It's called Pastoral, but it's a kind of anti-pastoral. Together, you standing before me, before the picture window, my arms around you, our eyes pitched beyond our reflections into, I'd written, as though there, swung at the end of a tunnel, a passage dotted with endless points of arrival, as though our gaze started just outside our faces and corkscrewed its way toward the horizon, processural, as if looking took time to happen and weren't instantaneous, offered whole in one gesture, before we ask, before our will, as if the far Sonoma Mountains weren't equally ready to be beheld as the dead fly on the sill. The distance, a broad hill of bright mustard flowers, the morning light coaxes open.
Wow. Well, thank you. That was perfect coda to the event. And Hunter has just posted again the link to how to buy Forrest's new book from City Lights. And I don't know. I don't know how to thank you for making us your first book event.
New
for the
Directions
book.
too. Thank you, New Directions. Thank you, Jane and Jack and Hunter, and thank you, Litquake. Yeah.
Well, thank you all for coming, and please buy his book and tune in because we have a few more epicenters left before we take a break for the summer and come back strong with our hybrid festival.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Jane.
Have a good night.